I rarely ever twist something or take a path that I think that the professor, based on the French system, would think this is a good argument. I would never take a path of like, oh yeah, this is a clearly interesting thing to put against each other to just show how it superficially doesn't work together, because that is dialectical. But also, I'm using dialectics in a very bad way. Dialectics is just supposed to show that, like, you know, how it is that we had a separation just to be clear about something, but in the end, it's a unity. Hi, my name is Wani, and I'm a philosophy student at l'Arc-Sorbonne, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how it is that I wrote my paper on becoming someone. So the title I put was Becoming Someone, Personal Choice in Society. Does it remain a thing of fiction? I had to check. Essentially, I have the main part of my entire process here. And I'm thinking of splitting this into 2 videos. So in this specific video, I'll talk about the process of how it is that it comes together. And then in my second video, I'll talk about tips on writing an introduction, which in my opinion is the most important part of writing an academic paper. And also I'll read my actual introduction in the second video. So without further ado, let me talk to you a bit about the process. So usually what happens is you have a class at the beginning. The professor gives you kind of like an outline. So for us, I think we had like 30,000 words or characters. 30,000 characters, including space, to write this paper. And it's kind of like short for a lot of French people, but for me, like, I personally like writing succinctly, but usually it's also because I have other things to do. So that word limit didn't really bother me. What you usually have to do is that you actually have to go up to your professor and like pitch an idea, essentially. So my personal situation about this was that I was speaking to another professor who was talking to me about something else, and he recommended this book by Badiou. I'm learning how to pronounce French words. Badiou, because you're going to know that the other book that I actually worked on was Bourdieu. So Badiou et Bourdieu. So this book is tiny, it's dense, and it's hard for me to say if it's like super complicated, because as Krishna reminded me over one of our Axioms calls, that, you know, I've been doing this for a little bit of a while now. Like, obviously nothing compared to my professors, but I've been doing this long enough to actually forget how much background information is necessary to be had to actually enter certain texts. I would say that it's readable, but I think it's also highly metaphysical, obviously, because he is the man of absolute truth. But yeah, I really resonated with this, so I was really happy to be recommended it. So I didn't know how this would work for anything. I was reading this for something else. And then when I thought about like a question for my class and it has to, obviously speak to the themes of the class, I obviously am a big reader of Bourdieu, if you've watched my other videos on Bourdieu. And I was just thinking, I don't really know what I was thinking. I was just like contemplating different ideas about it. And then I just went up to my professor one day, like literally while I was still reading this, because it was like before the holidays and you think about how it is that you want to pace things. And I just came up with this like piece of paper, and I wrote like on one side, okay, Badiou, it's like he has situation, and then Bourdieu on the other side is like champ social, like social domain. On one side we have like maxime de la consistance d'être fidèle à la vérité, like the maxim of consistence to be faithful to truth. The other side we have like habitus, and then I have like, on one side Badiou talks about the disinterested interest, and then Bourdieu is about goût, which is taste. And then, I made like all these oppositions, and, every time like I go and pitch something to my professor, I'm always ready for them to say like, no. I've been told that sometimes like I see connections that no one else will ever see. So I was really surprised when I brought this up to my professor, and she was just like, it's really great, because how it is that you would think that they would have nothing to do with each other, because I asked her if she knew, Badiou's work, and then she's like, not really, but she knew that he was, Mr. Absolute Truth. And then like, you know, with Bourdieu, it's like statistics and the practical world. So how does like this metaphysical promise match up with the practical world? And I said like, you know, I kind of was apologetic because, you know, you always have to come in humble before people, you know, it's just to try to get your point across. But in the end, you know, when I said, yeah, you know, I always come in with like these things that people don't see that make sense, but to me, like I see that they do, and I would like to try to see how they connect to one another. And she's just like, no, like, you know, and she starts reasoning about like, you know, the steps and what she understood about both authors. And it was really great to see like how it is that she was building links as well. And she said like, you know, I think it makes for a beautiful opposition. And I think it's like such a really nice compliment when someone says that you've made a beautiful opposition, especially in French academia, which is like super about the dialectic and everything. So yeah, with that in mind, I had my little piece of paper and I was just like, oh yeah, I kind of already knew what I was going to do. Like I did all these oppositions, but this was before like I actually read Distinction. I had an idea of what it was about. You know, I have read enough of his work to get an idea or like have a presupposition of what it is that Bourdieu would have said with statistics. But it was actually much richer and much more interesting. I read like, how many pages is this? I read about like, I think 300 pages out of like, yeah, 630 something pages because you just don't have enough time in the day. Yeah, and essentially like, you know, I discovered new things. The initial opposition was not really there. I'll be honest, the grade that I got was a bit disappointing to me, but that's also because I'm very like invested in this idea. Okay, the grade is a good grade, objectively a good grade, but you know, I'm obviously used to higher grades. But I'm just being transparent about like how it is that it plays off. And my thinking is that because I made them really make sense together and I didn't really push the opposition or the perceived opposition, or what I'm learning is that what I need to do is work on dealing with how people would oppose my ideas while presenting my ideas, which is something I have to, you know, with time and patience arrive at. You're supposed to show that there's a tension and a problem, and this tension, you know, is actually what keeps things together. It's not supposed to be what separates things, but this is a whole nother topic. So with Badiou's ethics, essentially what I did was like I made a little note thing. This is also why like it takes a long time for me to do a lot of things, because like, you know, I write out my notes for what I think is interesting, and I also obviously now learned really, really well to write the page numbers, mainly because like once I reorder and restructure what it is that I believe that is said or is interesting, and I also get to like, you know, break them up into sections and then create like the oppositions for myself to look at. These are all not things that I would definitely add into the dissertation because you only pick like a few key quotes to actually bring about one point. But at the same time, like I always say to myself, like the work that I do now is so that in the future I don't have to reread the entire mini book again. But like, you know, because I have like a better mental association with this construction of his arguments, I would come back to this and then it would be sufficient for me to, you know, if I ever in the future 2 years from now be like, oh yeah, what did Badiou Badiou said about something in ethics, then I would come to this. So I plan also with my notes, like not only for each specific project, but a project that might ask for it in the future. So as I said, I read that one first, and then after that I read Bourdieu's La Distinction. So I kind of did the same thing, but because I knew that I had about 300 pages to read, I obviously did not take as efficient notes as the other one for ethics, but also like there are just some authors that for me like I feel like require more time, and ethics obviously is a bit more opaque because it's more abstract and it just takes a bit more processing. But with Bourdieu, it's not simple either, but it is simpler because he's just trying to communicate or, you know, be very, very smart at translating his interpretations of statistics. So yeah, I had all of this, and I also realized like I don't think you can see it, but I took my notes also like constantly thinking in opposition to Badiou's wow. At the end of this video, I'll know how to pronounce his name. Work. So I always have like this division, and then I always like try to show like, okay, access from ethics, how it is that it relates to taste. But as I like worked on it more and more, I realized that, you know, those weren't the most interesting oppositions. They were like, if you didn't read the whole thing and you just like ChatGPT wouldn't even know much, I don't think. But like, if you were to have like the most superficial, stereotypical understanding of how you would oppose the text, that's where I started. And then when I read, I was just like, oh no, they're actually both saying the same thing. After that, because you know that my primary language is not French, I usually write my my introduction. I was gonna say in English, but there is like, it's like Franglish, it's like English and French. And you just have to be okay with like just like crossing out the entire things at the bottom. But sometimes it's like, for me, very helpful to simply write everything that you have. And sometimes like, you know, my introductions, they seamlessly come out. And I'll talk a bit more about how introductions work in my other video. But essentially like with this, I felt like the main thing was just to try to set the tone of like the problem at hand, and then after that, you know, talk about how it is that we used two other thinkers to bring it back together to arrive at a specific goal. So I did that first in English, and then after that, you're gonna see that like, you know, what I did was I wrote down all the essential quotes, and this is so fun sometimes, and you're like, oh wow, that took a lot of time. So I did like side-by-side notes for specific parts. So my first part is, what does it mean to be someone? So on which side is which side? Oh yeah. So on this side, it is Ethics by Badiou, and then on this side, it is Bourdieu with La Distinction, and how it is that I was thinking that, you know, and then I did that for all of the three sections. The second section is, what does it take to be someone? And then my third is personal choice in society. Is it a possibility or pure illusion? So then, as you can see, like, I tried to find like ways that I felt like the arguments work together. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't use half of the stuff that I wrote here, but I just keep telling myself that like me writing it down helped me analyze and process it more, of like how it is that it will work together. And yeah, and you just sunk costs, you know, sacrifices. But I couldn't have moved forward without doing this step anyway. And then you will see that, well, yeah, what I have here is like French first tries at writing each part to kind of see how it flows together. Because the most important thing that oh no, this is the introduction that I rewrote in French. Because like, you know, it's just about getting it out and then, you know, try to figure out like how it is that they work together, because it's supposed to come out in a linear way. You know, life happens like this, but like all arguments need to happen like this, you know, in a nice linear way, with the ping pong of the dialectic. In France, anyway. These were in French because sometimes I'm like, okay, if my English cognitive skills is not getting me forward, I need to resort to French. So that is my process. And then after that, I have my first draft that I print, and then I do corrections. And then this time, like, it was so sweet. I don't know if you guys remember Jenna, who I also have another video to edit with her, but she's the one who helped me introduce my postcards. I'll link it down below if you want to watch. It's a bit about our friendship as well. But I was at her place like really late, and she was super tired, and I was like super excited about this idea, and I just wanted to see if, like, you know, a person outside of philosophy can understand something that's so dense. And she was so sweet to like listen to everything that I was saying. And yeah, I always like print out like my first draft, and then I correct it by hand, because I feel like I always miss things when they're on the computer. So then that is that is like my very last step before I redid my entire thing. But the hard thing was realizing that once I got to this point, I literally was like, oh my God, like, it just doesn't work. you know, the thing is like you're so like on task to try to fit all these things together, but you just always miss something. So then I was like reading it over and over again, and I was just like, there's something that just, it's like there's a knot somewhere that's just not coming apart. It's not making sense, it's not flowing. And just know that part of the process, or the majority of the process, is you just literally being like, what am I trying to say? What am I trying to say? What am I trying to say? But in the end, I wrote something that I'm extremely proud of. I shared it with the group in the Axioms call, and I think, you know, a lot of people want to read it, but all the quotes at the bottom are in French. So the paper itself is also in French, and I find it very difficult to just like chuck it onto like an app to translate it into English, because it just doesn't work that way. But yeah, this is my process of how it is that I write a paper. We usually get, well, it depends how you schedule yourself. You usually get like your consigne, like, you know, your limits and how it is that, what it is that they expect from you. If you're lucky, like, you know, 3 or 4 weeks into your classes. And then after that, you do this while you do your main research paper and your other 4 subjects plus language, and plus I also took ancient Greek. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope you're interested in hearing the introduction in the next video.